Dr.
Yeah.
Dave Demmer on the Daycast. Thank you for joining us here.
Thank you for having me, mate. Yeah, thank you.
Now, there are some freaky synchronicities that happened while we're here. I saw a video, I saw a video of you on YouTube, and I'm like, man, this guy's, I liked your flavor. I liked the approach that you're taking, which we'll get into all that kind of stuff. And then I reached out, and then crazily enough, we talked about, I was from Melbourne. I was from around the area that you're living, and it ended up you live in the same building that I once lived in, which is just absolutely incredible. So, yeah. But for those who do not know you, Dave, can you give a wrap up of who you are, what you do, and your specialty?
Sure. Yep. So, Dr. David Demmer. So I'm a clinical psychologist with a focus in men's mental health, particularly. So I trained at Deakin University, did my undergrad, my honours, and my clinical doctorate there. I've had, I guess, a couple of roles in my professional career so far. When I was training, I worked in acquired brain injury and rehabilitation and social reintegration and things like that. My research area has always been around gender and the influence of gender, particularly masculinity, on mental health disorders. I worked at a private hospital here down in Melbourne in their inpatient and outpatient psychiatric wards. So I had a lot of fantastic experience there. While I was there, was privileged enough to be able to kind of design and implement the first men's outpatient program that combined both psychology and exercise physiology. So kind of targeting a little bit more of a holistic approach, but, in order to really have a focus on mental health and the impact that, obviously psychology, but also exercise has on mental health. I was previously a lecturer at a university down here as well, where I chaired the counselling unit. Left that about a year ago now, as I opened with my business partner a private practice down here in Paran in Melbourne called Macquarie Street Psychology, where we have a special focus on men's mental health, and that's kind of the majority of who we see. One of my real interests is around first-time engagers, so men who haven't been through any type of mental health service before. And quite often those are the types of guys who might come maybe a little bit begrudgingly sometimes, maybe with some fairly well-ingrained kind of traditional masculine ideals and values. And, really enjoy being able to kind of work in that space and kind of break some of those down where needed in order to do good therapy, support the masculine values that are really strong and that are helping them in life, but maybe break down some of the ones that might be getting in the way. Just recently, my business partner and I also launched a new venture called Psych School, which at the moment is an online program. So we launched it. It's been an idea that we've had for quite a while, but then COVID hit, and we thought, hey, you know what? There's a lot of people out there struggling at the moment. Mental wellness is going to be really at the forefront of this process right now and well into the future. So how can we support people? So we put together a free 4-week program that just looks at how we can kind of cope while we're in lockdown, even though it's just about to start lifting, which is fantastic.
How has the lockdown affected you guys and what you do as far as professionally, and what has been the influx or the attitudes or the from society and people for you? What's been the impact for you?
It's interesting, actually. So I think, from this is kind of just my anecdotal experience, and certainly not talking from, that I have profound knowledge of the entire healthcare industry and other disciplines of healthcare. But from around the traps and doctors I've been speaking to, what's been interesting is that primary health, so outlets like general practitioners, found a real dip. A lot of clinics found a real dip in patients coming in. They've kind of suggested maybe it's because people were a little bit worried about going to a place where, quote unquote, people were unwell, and the worry about contracting coronavirus in those places. All clinics, the ones that I know are absolutely looking after the health and safety of anyone who walks in the door. And secondly, it seems that people maybe were a little bit worried about clogging up the health system. They thought, maybe if I've got a bit of a rash or I need a script filled, but I don't want to necessarily take space in a GP clinic that someone who's actually really unwell, maybe with coronavirus, might need. And so I think that really led to a downturn in people accessing primary healthcare, so the general practitioners. And there's always going to be a flow-on effect of something like that into the private practice psychology mental health system, because the vast majority of people who come and see us have been to a GP first to get a mental health care plan, to get a referral, to get that initial touch base and some initial support before a GP says, hey, maybe it might be good to speak to a psychologist about this. So I guess long story short, we saw a little bit of a dip, which was really kind of a flow-on effect from what was happening in the GP clinics. But there has certainly over the past couple of weeks been a real upsurge in people reaching out. There was a fantastic press conference given by the Prime Minister and the CEO of the Mental Health Commission. I think it was last week, where they came out and they said, everyone, your mental health is so important. Please ensure that you're getting support if you need support. They've pumped a lot of money into a lot of services, which is really fantastic. And there really is signs of a good uptake in that at the moment, because we don't want people to forget that this is a tough time. I don't know anyone who hasn't experienced some sort of stress or change or impact from this, and the supports are there. So absolutely everyone who needs it, please reach out.
When we talk about the masculinity and that being the main focus of what you're doing, what have you found is the irrational in maybe society's values, but for the person very real? What have you found have been some of the thoughts and the patterns and the behaviours that a man might come in with, and thinking he might be broken, or thinking that he's not normal, yet for him this is his reality? What have you found have been some of the common themes amongst the men that come and see you?
Yeah, look, probably no surprises with some of them around things like stoicism. So stoicism is that idea that men traditionally, should be emotionless, or should be strong and courageous, and emotions and vulnerability in particular doesn't necessarily fit within that pillar of masculinity, does it? It's almost seen traditionally, and I always try to talk about kind of traditional masculinity, traditional femininity versus what we're moving into, which is a more kind of fluid understanding of what it means to be a man, or what it means to be a woman, or anything else. So stoicism, absolutely. That difficulty being vulnerable. And there's also a really fantastic term in psychology, particularly in research, called alexithymia. You ever heard of alexithymia? No. Yeah. So alexithymia is basically the idea that or you have alexithymia, or you struggle with alexithymia when you don't have language around your emotions, and you don't know how to articulate them. So you're not necessarily understanding that, hey, this is sadness, or this is anxiety, or this is fear. So it's a really great way to understand that a lot of men, and women too, but alexithymia is much more predominant in men, that they actually don't have language around their emotions. They haven't been taught about emotions, which is such a common place. I talk to most of my clients about this idea of, where did you learn about emotions? Who taught you? Because you think about the things that are pretty much definites in life. You need to eat, you need to drink water, you're going to need to go to the toilet, those types of things. You need to breathe. Emotions are hardwired into us. Like they're there. We're all taught, how to use a bathroom. We're all taught how to eat with a knife and fork. We're all taught how to tie our shoelaces. No one's over here teaching us, what is an emotion? What do you do when you feel something? And so if we grow up in that type of context where that information isn't really given to us, then of course, when we're adults, we're probably going to struggle with that. Yeah, we know how to tie our shoe. We know how to eat with a knife and fork. But I don't know what to do when I'm angry. I don't know what to do when I'm anxious. So, the actual education around emotions and what to do, I think, is a big thing. What I find too is, unfortunately, by the time I see, a lot of my clients, there's already some, pretty negative impacts. There's already some pretty detrimental things going on for them. And part of my work is, particularly in my research, is trying to break down or trying to understand what it is that stops men from coming to therapy. Because we know that only one in 4 men who actually have a mental health disorder will ever seek treatment or seek support for it. There's 75% of men out there with some sort of treatable difficulty like depression or anxiety or OCD or whatever it might be, who actually just go and don't seek support and probably struggle and have negative impacts in their lives. So I think that stigma definitely is an issue. So alexithymia, stoicism, and the stigma around seeking support.
In the USA, there's basically having a therapist is almost like, or more common than seeing your doctor almost. It's like, oh, who's your therapist? And it's almost part of daily life. And I don't think it's moved that way necessarily into Australia yet. But do you see it as it's going to move into a service, almost like a mental service, where, you get your car service once a year? Do you foresee that the future for therapy and psychology and seeing someone professionally for mindset or for your mental health, is that going to move into, and are you seeing trends to move into a monthly model, or starting to see more frequently that this is now going to become the norm, that everyone, not everyone, but a larger majority is going to move into that way of thinking, as opposed to hiding it, keeping it secret, or thinking they don't need that tune up or the checkup or someone to pop in?
Yeah, look, I absolutely hope so. I think that would be fantastic. I don't know if I see a trend towards that yet. That's, I guess, my anecdotal experience. I don't know what the research says specifically about that question, but there might be. I don't know of one. It's an interesting question. No one, I've actually never had that before. So great question. So I'm not sure. One thing that I'm particularly passionate about is prevention rather than cure. And that's what, when we founded Psych School, that's absolutely what we, the approach that we were taking, that, hey, can we focus on building up people's mental wellness before they need to get to a point where they need to see, a psychologist for 10 sessions a year, that type of stuff. Because by that point, stuff's gotten pretty bad, or has the potential to get pretty bad, or we're taking a more curative therapeutic approach rather than a preventative resilience type approach. The more I always say my ultimate goal here is to put myself out of a job. And if there was no one that needed to come see me, then I guess I've kind of done my work, haven't I? I don't think that will, of course, ever happen, and we always need mental health professionals. It's a bit tongue-in-cheek when I make that comment, but the more people that we can catch before they need to perhaps come to see a psychologist, and they're kind of at that pointy end of what's going on for them, I think is super important, and really, at least personally, where I love focusing my efforts.
How many years did you have to study for to get to clinical psychologist and where you're at right now?
Yeah, so look, it's not short, mate. So you do an undergraduate degree, which is, your typical 3-year university degree. There's a couple of different pathways. So you have to start with your 3 years. So I did a Bachelor of Psychology, which is actually 4 years, and it includes the honours, the 4th year component, where you do a little bit of professional training, but you do a kind of a small thesis as well. So everyone has to do the 3 years and then the 4th year. And then from there, there's a couple of options. To become a clinical psychologist, you must do some sort of postgraduate degree. So I did the doctorate, which was 3.5 years. So all up, I was at uni for 7.5 years. So in the doctorate, it's, a substantial amount of placement, substantial amount of coursework, and a really substantial thesis. And a master's is a postgrad as well. So that usually takes about 2.5 years, which has pretty much the same amount of coursework, but the thesis is much smaller, and there's a little bit less placement, but both get you to the point of becoming a general psychologist. And then you do 1 year of basically work, and while you're working, you're getting supervision and things like that, and then you go for your clinical endorsement. So it takes roughly at least 8 years, if not a touch longer, to become a clinical psychologist.
What were the biggest shocks to you, or the biggest conversations you were thinking inside your head, questions you were asking from what the theory was saying, what you were reading about, and then in the practical side of things, once you got in the field, you go, oh, I didn't expect it to be this way, or I thought it was going to be this way. And then you're like, but in practice, it's actually a lot different. What have been some of the markers for you? And like, well, taking a step back.
Yeah, great question. It's tough to learn therapy through a book. It's tough to learn therapy in the classroom. We learn obviously the frameworks, the fundamentals, the approaches, and a lot of it isn't necessarily rocket science. Like a lot of the things that I might do with a client who presents with anxiety, for example, might be some basic breathing techniques. Might be some, relaxation strategies. It might be, scheduling some time out and some pleasurable activities. So, there certainly is some really advanced stuff, obviously, that we do. But, a lot of my work is in that really, not rocket science type space. And so sometimes when we're going through training, and even as we're practicing, sometimes you might have the thought like, oh, I'm training a lot in order to teach someone maybe how to do a breathing technique. That seems, like maybe I don't need to go to university for 7.5 years to teach that. But I think what it is once you're out there and you're practicing, you realize the individuality of each case. Of each patient, I should say, each client. You recognize how they come in with a history behind them. They come in with a range of different thoughts. They come in with a range of different emotional experiences, a range of different behaviors and responses and strategies that they've already been using, whether they're helpful or particularly unhelpful. And so I think that's where the clinical judgment that you spend so long training for and developing really needs to come in. And I think that was probably my biggest shock to the system, I guess, is there really isn't a one size fits all approach. And this type of breathing might work for someone and it might not work for someone else. And it's about understanding the differences between person A and person B, and how to implement the right type of therapy, how to change your approach in order to suit that person. I think that's probably why we potentially see a lot of psychologists who do have a focus in certain areas. So maybe people focus on eating disorders. One of my focuses is obviously men's mental health and masculine values, and how they can impact people's lives positively or negatively. Other people work in the child and adolescent space. Like people work with populations or with disorders, because to really have a secure hold on the entire breadth of mental health in therapy would be really, really difficult. Yeah.
Why do you think that, because a lot of the techniques, or not a lot, but some of the techniques you're saying are, breathing exercises or just helping someone cope and just getting a different perspective. And so some of the stuff that you might be doing is, could be considered common sense to us out of the pain, out of the instance. But for that person, it's a very harsh reality. It's like, they've almost not forgotten, but they don't have access to the tools to be able to learn, okay, this is how I need to breathe during times of stress. I need to reach out to someone if I'm feeling disconnected as a person. So why do you think that happens? What happens to the brain that puts us into a state of, I can't think normally because right now I'm in pain, I'm in X state?
With lots of different reasons. Maybe, first and foremost, I always talk to people about what are you doing already? And maybe they actually don't have some of those strategies yet. No one taught me how to breathe. It was just an automatic thing that happened, when I was born. But and to think about this idea that, hang on, there are right ways and well, there's no wrong way to breathe, but there are helpful ways to breathe, particularly when we are dysregulated. But what I talk to clients about is actually this, I was teaching some students this last night actually, and I just think this is such a profound thing to understand, is why we might struggle to use more adaptive mechanisms when we're struggling. So there's two parts of the brain that I just want to talk about. So right, down near the kind of prehistoric part of your brain, the reptilian part of your brain, is a little center called the amygdala. And the amygdala is where your emotions come from. So when you feel something, when there's an emotion activated, the amygdala lights up. Then we have this part down the front called the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex, compared to all other living creatures, humans have the biggest prefrontal cortex relative to the size of their brain. So, an elephant's going to have a bigger one, but, relative to the size of the rest of its brain, it's not, it doesn't have the same volume as ours. That's what makes us, the prefrontal cortex is really what makes us, king of the jungle. It's where all of those higher order functions sit. So things like, rational thought, decision making, problem solving, assertive communication, logic, all those things sit in our prefrontal cortex. So all those things that we need in those moments when we're dysregulated. And what happens is this little amygdala over here fires up. And once it reaches a certain point of emotional activation, so maybe on a scale from 0 to 10, maybe we hit a 7. So we're fairly dysregulated, we're getting pretty emotional. We watch it and it actually floods the prefrontal cortex. And we watch it under brain scan and it turns the prefrontal cortex off. So goodbye problem solving, goodbye logical thought, goodbye rational thought, goodbye assertive communication, goodbye all those things that we need in those moments where we're really heightened and we need, to be able to remind ourselves to breathe. We need to remind ourselves to, be kind and gentle in the communication, in the conflict that we're having right now kind of thing. So, I talk to my clients about this idea of we want to catch that before it happens. We want to start recognizing what our 4s and 5s and 6s are on that scale, so we can start bringing ourselves down. Because once we tip over, a 7 or an 8 for some people, whatever it might be, you're actually going to lose all of those things that are going to help you to be able to regulate yourself in the moment. Yeah. And I'm guilty of it. I'm sure we're all guilty of it. That
100%.
Emotionally flooded. Yeah.
What about your biggest influences? Who have been like the people you've studied under the most that have really had an impact on your work?
So originally, when I first started studying, I followed a lot of the work of probably one of the most notable psychologists in Australia, Michael Carr-Gregg, who focuses on child and adolescent work. He does some fantastic stuff. I'm, very much trained in the cognitive behavioral therapy approach. So, people like Beck, who founded that, is someone who, you can't become a psychologist and not know the work of Beck and CBT. There's some great stuff from a guy named Stephen, and I forget his last name right now, who was really one of the founders of acceptance and commitment therapy as well, but came up with the theory of acceptance and commitment therapy before simply kind of developing the actual program. There's some great stuff out there from more some kind of, I guess, what we might think of as more kind of motivational psychology type individuals, like Brene Brown. Have you heard of Brene Brown before?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
And her work on vulnerability, I think, is so important. I raise it with so many guys that I work with, because to flip back to that earlier point around what is it that kind of gets in the way for men, that idea of stoicism and needing to be brave and needing to be courageous, and they think that hiding that emotion or shutting down emotion and not connecting with it is what is brave. If I'm strong and I'm stoic, then I can be brave. Where Brene Brown really flips that on its head and says, actually, bravery comes from being able to say, hey, this is what I struggle with. Like, if that's the one thing that we're really terrified about in life, then that is the definition of bravery, is actually owning that and coming out with it. And vulnerability, I just think, is such a important aspect of being able to really connect in therapy. There's some fantastic stuff from positive psychology. There's fantastic stuff around self-compassion at the moment. I work with pretty much every single client I see around some aspect of your inner critic versus kind of your inner self-compassion, or how would you treat someone when they're struggling as opposed to how you treat yourself when you're struggling, is super important, I think. we're really hard on ourselves. That's
hard.
Actually, you know what? To come back to one of your earlier questions, mate, where you asked what was one of the things that left me a bit shell-shocked when I stepped into practice. It's probably how hard we are on ourselves, and probably how much we are critical towards ourselves, how much we will put ourselves down when we're struggling, how much we all struggle with a sense of self-worth, and we're so quick to kind of get the metaphorical whip out when we make a mistake and hurt ourselves even more, as opposed to being gentle on ourselves like we would if someone else made a mistake.
Isn't it so interesting? Like you might have 20 good things that happen to you during a day, or 20 things that you see as a positive towards your goal. And then one bad thing will happen and you label it a bad day when really it was just that 5 minutes. But we're so hard on ourselves that one mistake we made, or that one thing that we didn't do that was in line with our goals, it just all of a sudden, it's almost like a 1 to 20 ratio where for every 20 things we do good, if there's one thing wrong, that's what the human mind focuses on. I find that fascinating.
Yeah, and when I talk to clients about that, actually, I try to put it in the context of, from an evolutionary perspective, we are designed for two things. We are designed to procreate, or we're designed to survive. So I like to think about emotions having kind of broadly two kind of camps. We've got the emotions for surviving, and we've got the emotions for thriving. And we need to survive, and we are programmed to survive before we thrive. Like if you look at something like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we need the survival stuff, and everything else is kind of afterwards. Everything else is a bit of a bonus. So, things like anxiety and, anger and sadness, they're all kind of within the survival mode. Things like excitement and happiness and pleasure and joy, they're in the thriving type of area. And talk about this idea that due to that we're wired to survive before we're wired to thrive, we are programmed to focus attention here. And we are programmed to look for the threats before we're programmed to look for, the benefits and the good things in life. And, so from an evolutionary perspective, it makes sense. It's not nice, but it absolutely makes sense. Yeah.
What do you think are the differences, or can you explain the differences to our listeners around, because I know a lot of men are lonely. It's a big problem that we face. Can you explain from a psychological point of view, what's actually going on for us, lonely versus alone? Why is it happening? What can we do? What are some strategies that you implement with some of the guys that you are practicing with to help with this? Because it's a massive problem right now.
When I'm talking to clients about the idea of connection, the first thing I like to do is define the difference between being alone and being lonely. So, as I say in psych school, being alone is really just a behavioral situational experience or state. It just means, not having anyone around. I'm alone in this room right now. And the difference between that and loneliness is an emotional experience. So it just means that loneliness is about feeling that sense of disconnection and recognizing that you might be disconnected. Now, what's important is that you might not be alone. You might be in a crowded place, but still feel lonely. And that's when, with my clients, I'm working around this idea of, okay, there's something a little bit deeper here. And what's also important is to recognize that things like loneliness and sadness, and hopelessness, they are really down-regulating emotions. So they will power your body down. And that often leads us, when we're in pain like that, it leads us to, a natural reaction is to retreat and to protect ourselves. So what tends to happen is when we're feeling lonely, we tend to disconnect even more because we're feeling that pain and we're trying to go into kind of a preservation mode almost. So it's important that we recognize that when we're feeling lonely, we're probably going to have the urge to protect and withdraw even more, when actually the opposite is what we need to do to connect. There's really fantastic research, that's been put out by sources like November around men and loneliness in particular. And I know one of the ones that just blew me away was the idea that a third of men are happy, so this is Australian men, a third of men are happy with their social connections, a third of men are not happy, and the last third actually don't have any. There's 2/3 of men out there who do not have appropriate social connections, and I just think that is that's something that we absolutely need to work on, and it's tough, particularly maybe not so much for our generation, but certainly I think about my dad's generation and things like that. That kind of their ability to connect in a meaningful way through things like vulnerability, through things like emotion, through things like shared values, is really tough because they weren't really exposed to that kind of stuff. And there are lots of good options out there. There's things like Men's Shed. Mr. Perfect is a really wonderful charity based out of Sydney with Terry Cornick, who they have what they call barbecue meetups. They're just about to relaunch, I think, after what's been happening with coronavirus and the lockdown and stuff. But they have barbecues all around Australia where men can just kind of turn up and they have a host and they chat and they can talk about more kind of meaningful stuff, how they're going at the moment, those types of things. And I think he actually just during coronavirus he might have actually made them virtual. But there are certainly organisations like that. Beyond Blue has some great programs for men to be able to connect in as well. But there really is still a lack of that stuff, unfortunately, at the ground level, which is our responsibility as a mental health profession to be championing that type of stuff.
What do you think? Because right now, coronavirus, lockdowns, connection is happening via alternative methods, but it's not that in person. So we talk about, the reality is that, you're alone in the room right now. I'm alone in my room, but we're connecting. But from your research, from your professional experience, is there a difference between the connection we're having right now and some kind of energetic field or whatever you want to call it, and the brain recognizing, hey, Dave's via a connection that's, is he really real right now? Because obviously I can see you and I can hear you and there's gestures you're doing, but I'm looking at a computer screen. So is there a disconnect between the actual cyber connection that we have now versus you and I sitting across the table from each other? And how does that play into the grand scheme of connection?
Yeah. Look, this comes from an anecdotal place as well, but absolutely. I think, I can't think of too many clients I've been talking to during this period who aren't talking about the struggle of social distancing. And, I've also been talking to them about this idea of, I've wondered through this period whether we should actually call it physical distancing. I think that and, a lot of people in the mental health area are actually referring to it more as physical distancing, because we don't want to say be socially distant, because being social doesn't necessarily have to be only relegated to being physically near someone, but the impact of not having physical contact with people. I talk to my clients about the fact that they're struggling with a lack of even kind of literal physical contact, like being able to shake a hand or give a hug or have sex or any of that type of stuff. Is I think absolutely having an impact. I know that I'm feeling it myself. It's really, as clients come in, my really kind of typical MO is to shake everyone's hand. And as they're leaving, I open the door for them, I give them a pat on the back or something like that. To not be doing that, when it's just such a genuine and authentic part of who I am, I do struggle with it. And I wonder if, particularly in a first session, when I have to meet a client for the first time, that physical contact and that handshake is really, the treatment starts from there. Do you mean? Like the connection and the rapport that we build starts from there. And it's tough. Have you been experiencing kind of impacts from that, mate?
Because I work a lot online, there's usually the connection like this anyway, but and I also live with my missus. So from that point of view, I haven't experienced the loneliness like I have definitely felt in the past, obviously not during coronavirus, but I've certainly had, lived in an apartment with just me and my dog and definitely had feelings of aloneness and loneliness. But definitely, I have also definitely noticed that it is, when I walk my dog with my missus even, you know, there's as you walk past someone, that, you know, you almost don't look at them. You like look away from them because you don't want to breathe on them or whatever it might be, or you don't. And then even if you go to the grocery store, like no one's looking each other in the eyes, whether that's from like a, have you got the virus, or maybe they've got the virus and don't give it to me. I don't want it because I've got to hang around with my family or whatever it might be. But I love events. I love going to events. I love hosting events. I love bringing people together, whether that's for, you know, professional development, personal development, or even just like a dinner party or just like hanging out with mates in that surrounding, community surrounding. And I find like just not having the availability, I think it's a lot different now. If we had this conversation maybe 2 weeks ago or a week ago, even when there wasn't talks of when things going to move forward, because I think what happens in the human mind is if we don't have hope for the future, if we don't know there's no light at the end of the tunnel, we just sink deeper and deeper and deeper and think, oh, it's never going to get better. And for some reason, and maybe you can shine some light on what's actually going on inside the brain, but inside for us, we're like, for some reason, we just can't see a way forward. Logically, we know, well, it can't always be like this, but maybe it's the amygdala, maybe it's the human mind just going, yeah, but it looks like this is forever. And we can't see forward enough to realize, well, it can't be like this forever. It's not going to be like this forever. But I've certainly found with my own cases, we start to get inside this cycle and we go deeper and deeper. And it's like, oh, but what if it doesn't change? And what if this is our new way of living? And you talk to people and they're talking about how, you know, there is, like if people say, oh, look, once we go back to normal, and then you get half of people like, yeah, okay, cool. And then you get the other half going, well, there is no normal. This is our new normal. And we're going to have to find completely new levels of normality. But definitely I found that from a bringing people together point of view, like I'm excited and inspired and wanting to bring people back together. And I think it's going to be, I also think two things. One thing that when we do all get back together and rejoice, it's going to be really great to start with, but I'll be interested to see how quickly the hedonistic treadmill sort of kicks in and it starts to become, and we sort of forget about, because everyone right now, when it's not happening, everyone's going, oh, awesome, when we get back together, we'll do such great things. And we're going to, you know, when everything turns back to normal, we're going to spend more time together and be kind to our neighbors and all these idealistics, which is a nice thought, but I want to see what the practical application of that is after 2 weeks, after 4 weeks, after 3 months, 12 months. How
it actually unfolds.
Yeah, how it actually unfolds. Because right now it's nice to think those things, but is it going to happen? Don't know. Or for how long will it be? But yeah, I think it's, how do you think that, talking about that and mixing that into the connection, but then also let's dive into comparison for a second with social media. Why is it, or what can we do? What are some strategies, particularly for males who might be in the comparison trap of right now? I mean, if you're anything like me, you're spending a lot more time on these devices right now during this time, and it's so easy to get caught up in a scrolling frenzy, or you just sit there for what seems like 5 minutes, but then all of a sudden you look at the clock and you've been down there for like 40 minutes. Looking, scrolling, comparing, they're doing this, I'm doing this, what's wrong with me? What do you think is going on with social media, and how is that affecting us from your point of view over the medium or long term from a psychological point of view?
Cool. That's a great question. I've got some real big opinions about that, mate. Look, it's I think it has such an impact on people's self-worth, and I'm banging on about this idea of self-worth again, but it's just so important. I feel like it's the foundation of so much of our well-being and our mental health. Look, I think it's really fantastic in lots of ways. I think it's got lots of positives about it. It does bring some connection. Really, like I know that things like Facebook, for example, a lot of people connect with old friends and things like that through there, and people overseas, and it's an easy way to stay in communication. It's an easy way to stay connected and to stay updated on people's lives. The main caveat and the main disclaimer that I try to put on social media talks with my clients is that no one's putting the crap on social media, and no one's putting, like, everyone's kind of, well, not everyone, I shouldn't say it, not everyone, But the people that we're comparing ourselves to, yeah, the people with the fittest bodies, the people, you know, going for those, you know, lush international holidays, those people who are, you know, in those what seem to be fantastic relationships and, you know, have all these friends and always out partying and you know, they're all living their best life on Instagram. And it is a snapshot of an aspect of their lives. It is, and what we do is, you know, I'm not checking Instagram when I am, you know, on a beach in Mykonos, you know, living my best life. I'm checking Instagram. I'm sitting there on my couch, you know, in my tracksuit pants, you know, watching reruns of Seinfeld, you know, eating my KFC and looking at myself going, oh, this person's, you know, they're having this awesome time in life. And I'm sitting here like, you know, just slobbing it up a bit. Of course, I'm going to look at that and think, wow, okay, this is, you know, this is me right now. This is them right now. And it's really important to kind of take it for what it is. And I think that most of us are guilty. Like, you know, when I put a post up on, you know, my Instagram is more of a professional one rather than a personal one. But, you know, when I put something up on Instagram, it's edited. There's a filter over it. You know, it's designed to be able to, you know, I guess work for my brand and those types of things. It's not me sitting there eating KFC on the couch while I watch reruns of Friends. So I think that is super important. And the more that we get in that, I love what you just termed it there, comparison traps, and I'm gonna steal that and use that if I can. In that, the more we get stuck in that comparison trap, the more that we're really only going to make upward comparisons. This person, you know, has a better relationship than me. This person is going on better holidays than me. This person is, you know, has more social connections or more likes and things like that. That it's just never going to be a good thing. So is it great? Yes, it's great. But do we need to take it for what it is, a snapshot of a moment in reality rather than someone's full lived experience? I think it's super important to understand. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you'd be so surprised when you actually get to see the opposite side. And of course, everyone is only really, not everyone, but like you're saying, Dave, literally that point, like not everyone, but the majority of people are going to put up the things that they want the world to see, the things that they're most likely proud of, or the work, maybe the work that they put in, or in some cases, a life they wish they lived or they want to be portrayed.
Absolutely,
but really, it just takes that rational judgment from you as an individual to really take that 360-degree view and go, is that what it's like really all the time? Because if every single person has 360 degrees of a personality, and sometimes they're nice and sometimes they're mean and sometimes they're a slob and sometimes they're in shape, yet we're only really seeing, because we've got that. So we have a 100% 360-degree view, 24/7, 365 idea on what our life's been like since the day we were born until when our memories first started serving us until today. So we know every single thing that's happened to us, like a big brother camera has been watching, yet we're only getting like a tiny little 1 millimeter snippet of someone else's timeline across their entire life. And it's only the things, and we generally don't follow people who are doing worse than us unless we want some sort of weird quasi confidence boost and a comparing down thing. But we're looking at people who might have the things that we want, the rewards we want. And I've noticed two things with myself when I do it, is I'm getting caught up inside of looking at what they've got, but not looking at the work that they put into. And I remember I was looking at a guy and he'd achieved a certain result. I'm like, oh man, like that's amazing. He's so much further ahead than me. And then I'm like, looked on his website and I was like, here's all the courses he'd done. And for like the last 11 years, he'd been investing in multiple different courses and going to different locations and working with different people. And it was like, wow, okay. So it's not just, popped up overnight. And again, it goes back to the rationality thing. Like rationally, yeah, of course, you know that, but the brain is sometimes not always your best friend in those instances. But then you do get that perspective and you're like, oh, wow, like he's actually worked really hard to get to where he is. And so we don't see the first 10 years. And there's a really good graphic or meme or whatever you want to call it, which has, you know, a guy on the steps and he's juggling plates, but it's taken from behind. And so to the audience in front, it looks like he's just juggling, you know, four plates or holding the beams with the plates that are spinning on top. But behind him, which we can see, there's like 15 to 30 different plates broken along the ground because we can't see the journey upwards or you know, the free clients they worked with on the way up, or the mistakes that they made, or whatever it might be, and the 1,000 races, or the different songs that, you know, the top person has sung, Ed Sheeran, how, you know, I've done a lot of research into that, like how often he would play inside of pubs. He went to a gig, he played in a gig one time, Ed Sheeran, top of the top, he played a gig and no one showed up. And he played to the pub manager, or his manager and promoter and the pub manager, because no one showed up. And imagine if that was the case right now. Yet we look at him now, fills 80,000 stadiums, 80,000 people stadiums, and has, you know, millions and millions and millions and platinum records and whatnot. We go, oh, I want that. But are you prepared to busk for free? Are you prepared to put yourself on the line? Are you prepared to do all that stuff? And just by gaining that perspective, I love sharing stories like that, because then it allows you to go, I'm not behind, or I'm not as where I thought I was, and everyone has to go their particular journey. So then you can get back into the present, appreciate where you're at, and go, you know what? I'm going to take this one day at a time. If Ed Sheeran's done that, and use it as inspiration as opposed to jealousy, as an Ed Sheeran as an example.
Yeah, I think that's super important. And you know, even with someone like Ed Sheeran, like there's always going to be, you know, someone who came before you, or there's always going to be someone who, you know, at least appears to be doing a little bit better than you in a certain domain, or, and you know, we can absolutely use that for motivation and inspiration. But is it, I think, you know, when I'm talking about this with clients, I'm often talking about this idea, am I running towards success, or am I running away from failure? Running towards success is great, and we want that, because these instances are then going to be motivating. But if I'm running away from failure, that when I stumble across something and I fall, failure is going to come up and hit me in the backside, and, you know, it's not going to be nice. But can I use these things for motivation and start running towards success, rather than being kind of motivated from a place of fear of failure? Because there's always going to be someone out there who, you know, is potentially, you know, at least in your judgment, more attractive or more successful or more popular, or more whatever it is. And if we're wired and trained to kind of focus towards that, then we're always going to find it, and it's always going to be a struggle.
Man, that's absolutely amazing. It's just blown me away around running away from failure or running towards success. Incredible. Dave, we could probably talk for about 45 more hours. But good, mate. Where can people reach you? What's the best place to see some of your stuff, see what you're about?
So look, the two main areas are Macquarie Street Psych, so www.macquariestreetpsych.com. That's for the private practice. And then for psych school, it's simply http:// whatever that first bit is, psych.school, no .com or anything like that. And they're kind of the two main places, or of course, you know, Dave.Demmer on Instagram, or, you know, David Demmer on LinkedIn. Feel free to chuck us a follow, chuck us a message, say good day. Always happy to chat all things mental health and wellbeing.
Amazing, man. Well, I appreciate your time. I appreciate your insights. And
thanks for having me, mate.
Yeah, brother.
It's a privilege and an honor. Thanks, mate.
Awesome. All right. Ciao for now.